I have here a tshuva I'm going to put on the screen, which I thought was relevant. It had to do with Nusach HaTefillah. Why? Why do we talk about Nusach HaTefillah so much? Because we do, right? So here's I've already put on the screen the file of this. The Igros Moshe. You've read Igros Moshe? So I'll put that on the screen here so that everybody could see it. It's available at HebrewBooks.org. It's very important to read the Igros Moshe because of its historical value, its halachic value. Halavai, you should have the ability to write such a sefer. It doesn't mean that everything in Igros Moshe is 100% without, I guess, a dispute. You know, it's there's what to talk about. Rav Moshe Feinstein is an Achron. He wasn't an Eretz Yisrael. He disagreed with major other writers of Psak in his day. I think the most addressed ones, who was putting out tshuvas at the same time, Rabbi Avi Yosef and the Tzitz Eliezer. And there's major machlokas, and they have the Tzitz Eliezer and Rabbi Avi Yosef, of course, were in Jerusalem, and they are Batidin in Jerusalem. So Rav Moshe was stuck in Manhattan, unfortunately. So in a tshuva over here, he discusses Nusach HaTefillah. And the assumption was against, let's say, this whole project, this whole endeavor to get back to Nusach Eretz Yisrael. There is the beginning of, let's say, the first edition of the Sidur Eretz Yisrael. There's an article there by Rabbi Yisrael Ariel. You've read it before. Now, talking about how basically there's no binding Nusach. Because you could say we should go to do that which we've always done, the Nusach Abusena. But okay, so how far back do you go? Or was that ever binding? The Rambam say there has to be one Nusach and just stick to it. In the 20th century and slightly earlier, you will find eventually came out because the Hasidim and others had different ways to done. Let's say you visit Iraq in the times of the Ben Ish Chai, you will find that the synagogue service is quite different, and the siddur is quite different. And you go to Egypt, the Jews in Egypt are doing things a lot differently than what you're used to, let's say, in Lithuania or in Amsterdam. As a matter of fact, every place is radically different. So we circle the wagons and we say we stick to what we do. That's fine. The question put to Rav Moshe Feinstein was, I shouldn't even paraphrase, I should just read it directly there, because there's a valuable lesson there. Because Rav Moshe basically is romantic for a certain time period, what he defines as Ashkenaz. And that's kind of funny because if you apply his standard, we have a lot of work to do. I'll show it to you. It's hard to scroll through it. Am I sharing the screen? If you could see it on the screen, tell me. It's an Bar-Hayim, Chelik Beis, the 24th Tshuva. Take a second, right? We'll bench after this. Don't follow that clock. It's off. There we go. Sorry. I restarted the computer, so that's why it's not on my screen. Oh, hold on 1 second. Oh, I just passed it. Let's read it slowly. He says here, "Be'echad shehu mishpachash mitpal Nusach Sfarad." By the way, assume that there's such a thing, Nusach Sfarad. What is Nusach Sfarad? Talking about a person whose family uses Nusach Sfarad right. Nusach Sfarad, as we mentioned before, was something the printers invented. During the Hasidic movement, the people who were, I guess, the leaders of the movements, changed around the order of the prayers a little bit, here and there. Most notably, the Kaddish that's said many times during the service adds the words Yatzmach Porkane Vikar Mashiach, which, by the way, isn't so radical because Spartan been doing that for thousands of years. It's not necessarily part of the Nusach Eretz Yisrael, but then again, we know that there's a longer version of Kaddish. When you have the Kaddish Rabbanon that we say at a siyum or at a funeral, we have a much longer version. And that says about all these things are supposed to happen at the end of the days. So presumably Yatzmach Porkane Vikar Mashiach is in that list. And that, like all the other extras, is subsumed in the Amlich Malkutei. His kingdom come. By the way, I was just pointing out to someone that Christian Lord's Prayer has a lot of elements of basically Kaddish. Okay? And that's basically it is. The Christians who started using that prayer were basically saying a form of a Kaddish-like prayer. So it happened to be in a book written by Jews, and it was adopted by practicing Christians. I don't like what Christians do. I think that a lot of Christians, if they really were true to the truth, they should give up a lot of aspects of their Christianity. But the Lord's Prayer, I guess they could keep, because it's just, if you see it in Hebrew, it's almost very similar to what we say. They can stop building churches and stop doing, let's say, the Eucharist. Those are two little steps they could do, which would go a long way. Okay, and stop doing shituf, and then we could then we have what to talk about. So, Nusach Sfarad is a one size fits all prayer rite that the makers of the Sidurim made for various Hasidic groups, because every Rebbe himself puts out his own siddur. The Breslovers have their own siddur, the Chabadniks have their own siddur, the Stolners have their own siddur. That's their own. They're all very similar. Nusach Sfarad is basically saying that the printers took. They have their printing machines. They basically print general Nusach Ashkenaz, and to make a Nusach Sfarad siddur, like you see the ones printed by Weinberg and Eshkol and the other ones, it basically looks. You could see where they changed the settings, so that now it has Yatzmach Berkane, and they added the words that Nusach Sfarad uses. But you can see it's like a cut and paste job, and they basically modified the Ashkenaz. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein is going to mention that here. So that's Nusach Sfarad, and he's used to Vehud Nit Ragel Benusach Ashkenaz. He's used to davening Ashkenaz. Im tzorich l'shanot lenusach mishpachto. So now he's at a yeshiva finally. Should he be davening Nusach Sfarad all the time? You've heard the answer to this question. It was posed on the 25th of Shvat, 5722. So that would be 1962. Okay, this would be basically February 1962. Okay, so he says this question was received from Usher Zelig, a Cohen Rubenstein. I don't know who he is. I guess I should look it up, because some of the prominent names over here were actually real somebodies. Okay. B'davar she'avicha hu mishpacha shel chasidim shemitpalim b'nusach shekorin otha. It looks like a dalet in this printing, because this is not a good picture, but it says the nusach that they call, your father comes from the Hasidic families. They use for their prayers a nusach that they call Sfarad. It has nothing to do with Sfardim. Why is it called Sfarad? Because, it ain't Ashkenazic. It's like, why is Chinese checkers called Chinese? It's not American checkers. Chinese handball. They don't play Chinese handball in China. It's just not American, so it's Chinese. Okay. Aval, what's the opposite of a dog? A cat, duh. Right? So, Aval mikevan, she'avicha gar b'makom mithpalim b'nusach Ashkenaz. But since father now lives in a place where everybody's davening Ashkenaz, he doesn't live in Brooklyn. By the way, basically every shul there, they daven what's called Nusach Sfarad, because a lot of people of Hasidic descent are right in the middle of Brooklyn. You go to Manhattan or Queens, there they daven Ashkenaz. Okay, if you're in the New York area. The Gam Lamadita, well, it should be Lamadta, Bial Duthecha, Lith Palel Benusach Ashkenaz, Mishum Shekain Lamadusham, Velo Ratza Avicha Levabeletcha. You learned Ashkenaz because that's what they were doing in yeshiva, and your father didn't want to confuse you. Like a Sidurim they give out here, actually, they give the kids, they give their choice of a Sephardi Siddur, Ashkenazic Siddur, whatever it is. It really confuses my children. So, I may try to make it easy. I'll introduce them to all these different Sidurim when they get a little bit older, but you can't do this to a kid in grade school when they're like, here's what we do in school. It's like, oh no, you don't do that. So that's what the father did. He says, now that you're grown up, you have this doubt in your mind. Perhaps you're obligated, michuyav, to go back and start praying using that Sfarad siddur. By the way, like I said, the whole idea behind Nusach Eretz Yisrael and other things makes no assumption that of course you don't have to. There's no binding Nusach. Never was. Otherwise, the Chazal, the Rishonim, would have said such a thing. Okay, so there is no such assumption. But on this, don't forget, there are people who make such assumptions. Okay, and they have halachic arguments. Okay. You have to go back to what your father davened. He doesn't entertain the third. It's just, or maybe just find a third thing. But he will mention such a road of compromise, or just one size fits all. So he says, what are you going to do? So his answer begins. It is known that all the people, means the Jews, who lived in what's Poland and Hungary and Russia. And when Rav Moshe Feinstein says Russia, he means Greater Russia, the Russia that he knew. So that includes what's today known as Lithuania, Estonia, Belarus, Ukraine, all those Russian countries. Okay. He says, Levad mikomota rechokim karim. Okay. Karim, that's in the Caucasus, the Caucasian areas, places near the Black Sea.
Right.
In very South Russia, those places are already like Bukharians. So basically, everybody who was in all these lands were the Chadoma Haim B'nai Ashkenaz. They're all what you and I would call Ashkenaz. By the way, they're all genetically similar. Okay. And by the way, it doesn't even mention Germany. It's also Ashkenazic Jewry extends over basically Middle Europe and everything to the east until you get to, the stands, Central Asia. So they're all Ashkenazim. Af HaChasidim v'ad shenishpasta shitas HaChasidus hispalu kulam b'nusach Ashkenaz. Even the Hasidim were all Ashkenazic Jews. Genetically speaking, there's no difference. If you go to Chaslavich and Stalin and Karlin, there's the only difference between the Hasidim is that these people decided that they like the teachings of the best, and now they're going to dress funny, and they're going to, call themselves Hasidim. They're going to stop eating gebrocks. But it's just an offshoot. They're all basically Ashkenazim. He says they all used to daven what you and I call Nusach Ashkenaz. When did the Hasidim basically change the siddur? Give me an approximate. I put it at 1750. That's basically the lifetime of the Gra. Was big news in the Gra. Well, the Gra died in 1780 something, revolutionary times. The exact day, let's check it here. Well known, the day of the Vilna Gaon's. The Vilna Gaon's Patira, of course, is Sukkot, I think, right? The Gaon passed away on Sukkot in the Sukkah. Okay, so it was 1797. Right, the Gra died in 1797. His heyday was, don't forget, the Gra died at the age of 77. So he was a big mover and shaker already in his teens. Okay, so he had a long career as the Gra. So I'm putting it basically about 1750 or so. That's when they start doing these things. By the time the Gra it passes away, shortly before the turn of the 19th century, the Hasidim are what they are. They're not going anywhere. The opposition didn't win. Obviously, history has shown that. So he's mentioning that they all used to daven this Nusach, and the Hasidim majorly changed it. Okay, it says here. Basically, they're davening one Nusach that has changes. By the way, what makes it a different Nusach? Like the question I asked last week. At what point when you start playing, you're playing baseball, but now instead of using an actual baseball, you're going to use a softball, which is much bigger and softer. Yeah. And you're going to tell people they can use metal bats aside from wooden bats, and they have to pitch underhand instead of overhand. Yeah. And you could have 5 guys around the infield instead of a limit of 4. Yeah. So how many rule changes exist in softball? But you still say it's baseball. At what point do you say, topless, you're not playing the same game? It's what's known as the Calvin ball question. Calvin ball. No, it's serious. All games basically starts Calvin ball. All games start off with men trying to do something with the ball and get it to a goal point, and there's teams, and it's just details. Just permutations of things. And eventually the Calvin ball in Britain became polo and you wear horses, and the Calvin ball in America became baseball, and you either play it with bats or football or something, but they're all share these elements. Question is, when does it stop being what it is? Mm-hmm. Or I say the Machon, the children's book we're going to write about, my mother-in-law's first attempt to make my mother's recipe for cholent. How does it go? My mother-in-law wanted to make me happy. New guy in the family. They finally have an Ashkenazic American son-in-law, so they have to, make him feel at home. My mother makes a cholent that's very popular. We try to copy her recipe here. Maybe you've had the cholent. It's very popular. So my mother has her very strict recipe, her way of doing it. So my mother-in-law is very excited to tell me for Shabbos. She called my mother. She copied her recipe to the T. It's just like your mother makes. That's her refrain. Except my mother uses flanking. So my mother-in-law had to find that. She couldn't find it, so she used lamb. Lamb. That's going to taste just like beef. Beef flanking tastes just like lamb. And she didn't find the barley that my mother uses, so she used wheat instead. And she didn't find the right beans, so she used chickpeas also, besides the lima beans and the kidney beans. And she doesn't have one of those stovetop Americans. My mother's good old-fashioned American woman from, Ashkenazic descent. They don't use an electric plato. She takes a piece of sheet metal and puts it on the stove over the Shabbos and puts the cholent on that. My mother-in-law says, we don't have that. We have an electric, plato, like proper Israelis. So we're putting on the plato. And my mother serves it with kugel with kishka on the side, but she didn't have anything, so she put the kishka in it, and she tasted it. And my mother only put salt in her cholent, not even pepper or garlic. But it was a little bit bland, so I put Sephardic spices and some harif and everything like that. But other than that, it made it just like your mother makes it. Of course, it tasted nothing like it. It tastes like something like it tastes like a chamin that some Sephardic woman made. So it was fine, but it's not. So at what point? At what point do you say, like, tachlis, lady, this is not my mother's cholent anymore? How different does it have to be? By the way, but then you look, it's like Dr. Brill pointed out to us. Says, you don't know anything about religion in India. You think that all Indians are Hindus. India is a huge place.
Yeah.
A quarter of the world's population lives in India. There's a lot more religious variety there. And the Indians look at you and Christians and Muslims as just a variety of the same Abrahamistic monotheism nonsense as they think it is. So you have to see yourself. And also there's a pan-Oriental movement I was reading about and hearing about recently that the people are trying to unite. There's movements. The Koreans, Japanese, and Chinese have been fighting each other for centuries. There's wars and all that. They haven't been friendly and all that. But there are people who are trying to sell them. Look, we're very ethnically similar. We did once upon a time maybe have some roots against the Western world. The Russians and Americans are not our friends necessarily. We could be much more powerful if we unite. And we have shared values in certain ways. Now, I think that's not going to work because I think it's almost a racist thing to think that, what's the difference between Chinese and Japanese people? I say it as a joke, but like they're actually now trying to unite them. So the question is, when do you get to this point that what you're looking at is no longer what you're looking at? When is it baseball not baseball? When is it no longer my mother's children? How much did the Hasidim have to change before you could say, like, this is a different Nusach? Really, what did they change? So they say Yatzmach Burkhan every time they say Kaddish. In Shmona Esrei, they add a few words here and there. Psukkah de Zimra is different because they put Baruch Shamar here, but then again, we added stuff to Baruch Shamar. Everything we say right after Baruch Shamar in our Ashkenazic sidders are later additions. It's supposed to be Baruch Shamar and the Halalukas, and then Yishtabach.
Oh.
So what is a significant difference? You can say that. And not only that, is the Vilna Gaon and the Rambam have it. Psukkah de Zimra is your own personal meditation before Tefillah B'Tzibur. The really starts. The Tzibur starts with Chatzi Kaddish after Yishtabach. That's when you finally get a chazan going. That's like they do in the yeshivas, right? That's the real din.
Yeah.
So anything in Kriyas Shema and its brachas, the Shema is the same. Are the brachas before and after Kriyas Shema radically different? They say they add stuff to Tachanun. What makes it Nusach Sfarad? That's my question. But to Rav Moshe, this already is a significant difference. My question is does it really make so much of a difference in the long term? Would Rambam consider it different? Just a question. By the way, it's enough that it is, and this is significant. Why is it significant? It says here, "V'nimtza she'en lachshiv shinui minhag Moshe itchil Moshe hitchalto litpla nusach Ashkenaz av she'avicha v'od shnayim u'shlosha dorot hitchilu litpel b'nusach echadash." Rav Moshe is saying, really, you're all Ashkenazim. You were all davening Ashkenaz. So your father's family has been davening what's called Nusach Sfard for 2 or 3 generations. So what? Really, they should go back to Ashkenaz. You're asking me, can I start davening like an Ashkenazi person? Should I daven like a Hasidish person? Rav Moshe says, since when are Hasidim legitimate? They're supposed to be davening like the Ashkenazim. Okay? Yeah, that's basically what he said here. And I'm asking this question, wait a minute, the Vilna Gaon himself did a lot of differences. Aside from all the things that the Vilna Gaon himself did differently, which they let's say they try to do in certain places around there, so they're like, we're going to do like the Gra. But Rav Davlitsky I have from his typewriter. Rav Davlitsky has a long list at the end of his sitter, which he made on his typewriter. It says, here's a lot of minhagim that you find among the Ashkenazim of Eretz Yisrael. That's certainly not Ashkenaz of Chutz La'aretz, and it's not the Gra either. So that which we duchen every day, there's Birkas Kohanim.
Yeah.
Is that Ashkenaz? If you start doing that, is it no longer Nusach Ashkenaz?
If you're in Israel.
If you're in Israel, it's Ashkenaz. Yeah. So Rav Davitsky has a long list of things that are different in the synagogue prayer rite and in the siddur that are not in keeping with what you find in Ashkenazic Gullus, and also not according to the Gra. It's just things that the Ashkenazi community adopted, the Prushim adopted over the course of the 1800s.
I think.
Yeah.
I think specifically defining.
That's what the Vilna Gaon advocated for.
Ashkenaz was the lack of it in Gullus and the presence of it in Eretz Israel, I think that was always.
No,
I mean, that's
No.
that's what the Ramah says, isn't it?
no.
It's not what the Ramah says.
The Ramah is saying we don't do it. Remember, the Ramah doesn't recognize Ashkenazim in Eretz Yisrael because the Ramah is not talking about
No.
Ashkenazim elsewhere. The Ramah says in Medinos Elu, and he's talking
Right.
about Europe, we don't duchim.
Right, but if they weren't in those lands,
But if they weren't in those lands, then they're doing and they live, let's say, in Eretz Yisrael where the Beis Yosef is, then everything else they do is like the Beis Yosef. Remember, the Ramah and the Beis
at that
Yosef
time,
still lived when Minhag was
Yeah.
local. It's only
that
been the last
is still a thing.
the last two centuries that Minhag is suddenly no longer local, but Minhag is also hereditary.
Yes.
Now, even though the Chazal use this idea that Minhag is hereditary,
Yeah.
they say Minhag Avosechem, it's patently clear from the sugyas there that Minhag is not hereditary but local.
Mhm.
The best example is you go from, it says a person who lives in Bavel keeps 2 days of Yontif, person lives in Eretz Yisrael keeps 1 day.
Mhm.
They refer to the Minhag of the Bavlim, Minhag Avosechem. But it is also clear that a person who moves from Bavel makes Aliyah. He moves to Jerusalem the year 3.
Yeah.
He keeps 1 day Yontif. He doesn't say, oh, but my Minhag Avos, we've been in Gullus Bavel for 400 years. We always kept 2 day Yontif. There's no Minhag Avosechem. The Minhag follows where you are. And the Hefich, a Jew who's been living in Eretz Yisrael since Shimon Tzaddik times, and now has moved to Bavel, like Rav moved to Bavel.
Yeah.
He doesn't say, well, we've always kept 1 day Yontif. My ancestors always keep 1 day Yontif. Now in Bavel, I'll continue doing that. In Bavel, the Minhag is
Right.
2 day Yontif.
Right.
And that is the paradigm case in the sugyas that discusses in Psakim. And in all those cases, even though it's referred to as Minhag Avos, it is always local. So this is part of that change that the Ramosha is assuming that Minhag Avos is, even you could take it with you. You know, he didn't say you ended up in the Lower East Side and all the shuls there, Daven Ashkenaz, or you ended up in, what is it, Northern Manhattan. I'm forgetting Washington Heights, where YU and Breuers are, where everybody davens a form of Ashkenaz, right? He doesn't say, and I found that they had a Nusach Sfard minion once, like, just cranks who get together in like a shtibel, but they're the very small minority. In Elizabeth, New Jersey, Rav Teitz, the first and the second, kept it. Minhag Ashkenaz here. Eventually allowed some people to daven Nusach Sfarad. But that's local. That's the way it should be. Anyways, so he says, Ein lahachshiv shinui minhag Moshe etchalto le'itpalel Nusach Ashkenaz. You're not changing your minhag. The fact that you're davening Ashkenaz now and not Hasidim, they're the ones who changed. Okay. Sharei adarabah. On the contrary, Heim shinu minhag avosehem, v'rabosenu adire olam chachmei tzarfas v'Ashkenaz. Now he's invoking, by the way, the Tosafists even. Rashi and the Tosafos, Tzarfat and Ashkenaz. But wait a minute, Ramosha, are you saying you're romantic for old school Yakishim and Hagim? Because as Rabbi Hamburger points out, who's really researches Machon Moreshes Ashkenaz, Eastern Europeans themselves aren't sticking to the true Ashkenaz anymore. And he has all sorts of examples. He writes tons of books. You could find it. He has a lot of resources in Hebrew and English and a website. So the question is, he's being romantic now. Was he being romantic for Ashkenazic right pre-Hasidic movement, circa 1750? Or Ashkenazic right, Sarfas and Ashkenaz, Tosafists of the 12th and 13th century? They're radically different. Okay. Ve'enya dua ta'am barur b'mashe tiru l'shanot nusach hakavua neged harishami shevir magen Avraham in Reish Samich Es, in that simon in the Shulchan Aruch. It's not clear to me why the Hasidim made all these changes. It's neged what apparently the Magen Avraham derived from Yushami. Stick to your minhagim, and your prayer book is now one of those. Okay. He says I can't justify what the Hasidim did. Kimashe yesh omrim shenusach sfarat hu nusach klali lebi she'eno yodea shivto. There's an idea of the Ari that if you don't really, there's 12 gates of prayer, 12 tribes, and there's 12 nuschaos out there. Really? That doesn't make sense, because are you telling me all the Ashkenazim were from one tribe and all the Sephardim from another tribe? So why do they have Levites mixed in with them? Levites and Kohanim should have their own siddur then, according to what the Ari is saying. So it's a strange thing he said.
Unless his 12 is referring to the landed tribes.
Yeah, landed tribes. And you count the Ephraim and Menashe separately. But we don't have such a historical thing. It seems to be much more esoteric. But he said, you daven like the Ari, but the Nusach Sfarad is trying to copy. That's the 13th gate. Yeah. So the Chasam Sofer rejected this in his Tshuva. Shabbatel Svarazu. Chasam Sofer totally rejected that idea. The Gam Levar ze hanusach shemispalim eno nusach sfarad she'atika Rambam devrov dvarim hu kenusach Ashkenaz. By the way, it's not real Sfarad. If you want to do nusach Sfarad, who lived in Spain? The Rambam. Who left Spain? The Rambam. Who wrote his siddur? Here's how we do it. The Rambam. Real nusach Sfarad is like the Rambam, and you can find the Rambam's nusach in every copy of the Mishnah Torah.
Wouldn't he have joined in with the Egyptians?
No, well, maybe he did, but the Rambam mentions all sorts of rival minhagim that existed in Egyptian times. He's just trying to say that if you want to call it Sfarad, the Rambam, the Sephardi, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon Hadayan HaSfardi, he wouldn't recognize as Sfarad. He's saying it's just Ashkenaz with a few changes. It's not true to why are they even calling it Sfarad? Like I said before, calling it Sfarad is inaccurate. What you call Nusach Sfarad is not like Ashkenaz, but it's also not like what the Sfarad do, what's called Eidot HaMizrach now. Okay? Avram, which is part of the Pri Megadim, says, adding stuff isn't a change, it's just an addition. And Uchlal Ze Lo Nira, I don't agree with what the Pri Megadim says. Adding is changing also. Okay? Ki me'ayin lo divisvara, efshar lo marzeh. L'famim amosif korea. So just to know, like you're saying that additions aren't changes, call them mosif korea. Yeah, it's even worse. You're harming. Okay? Al kol panim ein anu ma'arim al elu sheshinu ki vadai haya lehem tam shereshaim l'shanot bazeh. Okay, I'm not trying to cause fights with the Hasidim here. They must have had good reasons why they did what they did. I can't justify it, but I'm sure the Baal Tanya had his reasons. Okay. You want to start davening Ashkenaz straight, you're going back to the way it was. Romanticism. That is, you're romantic. So my question is, how far back do you want to go? Which is why Nusach Eretz Yisrael, if you could say, well, Rav Moshe basically gave us like a precedent that he's saying, go back to the way it was before the Hasidim started up. So if you safely go back to the year 1700 before the Besht was even born, so Ashkenaz is Ashkenaz. At least it was then. But is that identical to the Ashkenaz of the Ramah in 1500 Warsaw? Is that the same as the way Rabbeinu Tam was davening in Troyes? I think how you pronounce it, Troyes or something.
Yeah, you got it.
It's written Troyes.
You got it.
Okay, so in France. Okay, are they the same? Is it the same as the way the Rush davened? I would wager that it was not. And matter of fact, you can look through all different Kisviyat of Sidurim. You could look at this Hebrew book and other archives. And I did this. I have about stored in this computer. I must have 50 machzers for Rosh Hashanah, just for Rosh Hashanah alone, throughout the ages. And you can see changes there, and that's just 1 day of the year, 2 days of the year, technically. So things have been changing. So my question is, how far back do you get romantic? So Rabbi Hamburger is much more romantic than Rav Moshe. He wants to go back to the old Yeki ways. Fine. And Rabbi Bar-Hayim is just more romantic, and Rav Shaki is just more romantic. They want to go back to Eretz Yisrael even before that. So it's a question: how romantic are you? How far back do you go? They're all legitimate in my view. Like I said, I myself didn't want to daven on autopilot. So when I was 18, I picked up a Sephardic siddur and used it for a little bit. I sometimes had to lead the services in yeshiva or in shul or in straight Ashkenaz, but I had a stoner siddur since I was 19. I've davened in places and led the service where they daven Nusach Sfarad, daven here where they daven actual Sfarad. The Rabbi Tar is like, daven Mar for us. I don't know. Okay, so I use their siddur. Thank God I familiarized myself with about 6 different nuschos, and I keep the Nusach, the Eretz Yisrael siddur in my talis bag. So when if I fall into autopilot, I know it's just time to change my siddur. That's what you really have to do. But my question is as follows. Now let's get to the thesis here. You're telling me, based on this tshuva, let's take Rav Moshe at face value. Let's work with Rav Moshe and make him our posek. We need to decide what to do in our shul. Someone told me that I had proposed for certain things. I put out a blog post saying, here's how we daven on Rosh Hashanah, the way the Gra wants to do it, and the reasons why it's better for the tzibur. Says you're making changes. That's not, we want to daven the Ashkenaz we're used to. by Rav Moshe's standards, that which I was proposing
Mhm.
is much truer to Nusach Ashkenaz, let's say on Rosh Hashanah, than what you are proposing and you using the Art Scroll Machzer, let's say, or the Rinat Yisrael. You know why? Because, like I've shown on the blog post, and what Rabbi Hamburger and others have shown much more clearly than I have, Goldschmidt, who put out the definitive critical edition of the Machzer in Bnei Brak a few years ago, which is available online for anybody to look through. His notes are all there. You could see that it matches the Machzorim that came beforehand. On Rosh Hashanah alone, there's so many different things that have been added and changed in the Nusach Ashkenaz Siddur since the times of the Vilna Gaon. By the way, you don't have to do all the things like the Vilna Gaon himself did. Just do like the Ashkenazim were doing. Just stick to the Chai Adam and the Ramah. There is so much there that is different from the way the classical Rishonei and Achroni Ashkenaz had. I would call what you have in your, let's say, Article Machzer, Nusach, not Sfarad, but not Nusach Ashkenaz. It's already something different. And the most important one that one came up, which I found was something that was worth fighting for, was the suggestion, the mere suggestion that if you open up a Shulchan Aruch and you find a straight line from all the Ashkenazic poskim, starting with Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam was the one who was mechadish this. How do you blow shofar during Musaf, during Chazar Sashatz? After every bracha, tashrat, one set of tashrat, as opposed to Gaonim Rif and Rambam will say, first bracha tashrat, second tashat, third tarat. Total of 10 blasts in Chazar Sashatz. No shofar during the silent Shemona Esrei. Never was. Lo hayav lo nifra. Rabbeinu Tam says a set of tashrat after every bracha. Nafkamina, 2 more blasts than the Gaonim and the Rambam, the Rif say. And that is the one that's endorsed by Rabbeinu Tam. That's Minhag Ramah. That's the Chai Adam. That's the Mishnah Berurah. That's the Vilna Gaon. That's everybody you can find before Rav Chaim Volozhiner and the Volozhin Yeshiva. And Volozhin, they want to adopt the Minhag HaShla to blow 100 blasts, but the Shla says 30 before Shemona Esrei, 30 during silent Shemona Esrei, 30 during Chazar Sashatz, and another 10 at the end, for a total of 100, which is about 2.5 times as much as the Gaonim said to do. And you have to blow during silent Shemona Esrei, and you have to blow a lot more during Chazar Sashatz. That's not Nusach Ashkenaz. That is mentioned by the Magen Avraham and not endorsed. That is mentioned by the Mishnah Berurah and then rejected. Twice he mentions it. In one place he says, "But you shouldn't do it. Stick to our minhag." He says, the Shla said to do it, but our minhag is not. It's not explicit that the Mishnah Berurah endorses the Rabbeinu Tam. By the way, you just have to read between the lines where he does endorse it. So my question to you is: wait a minute. You're telling me that if someone says, like Rabbi Hamburger and Rabbi Goldschmidt, and like Rabbeinu Tam and the Ramah say, you're not supposed to blow a shofar any more than what we have always done, which is a tashrat set after every bracha in Chazar Sashatz, for a total of 12 blasts during Chazar Sashatz. That's a very Ashkenazic thing. Certainly, according to this tshuva, like Rav Moshe says, before Hasidim came around, before Rav Chaim Volozhiner started the Volozhin Yeshiva, who was a Talmud of the Gra, by the way, but he wanted to wear Rabbeinu Tam tefillin. That's not the Gra. Either way, there's a lot that he was different. He was a different mind. That would be truer to Ashkenaz than your Art Scroll Siddur. All those extra prayers that Art Scroll added, the fact that the Brich Shmei is part of the Siddur, that became popularized in the late 1800s, early 1900s, especially because, well, it says in the Zohar to do this, so they include in the Siddur, and then Chazanim came up with nice tunes for it. Second Chazanim come up with a tune for something, becomes part of the process. It's established. There's a lot that's extra. Like I said, if we had a Machzer, we could start taking apart and showing everything that's been added, everything that was discussed by Achroni Ashkenaz and rejected out of hand. So according to this tshuva, when you open up your Art Scroll Machzer on Rosh Hashanah and say, "Oh, I'm going to daven Ashkenaz," you're very far from the truth. And lehefich, if you were to, let's say, just do a little bit of Rav Hamburger's Machzer, or Rav Goldschmidt's Machzer, or any old Art Scroll, any old Ashkenazic Machzer from the 1700s, or what I was basically putting on my blog, then you are actually doing what Rav Moshe says. That's the true Ashkenaz, and that's what you should be returning to. And if you're doing some other Nusach, and you're blowing 100 blasts and saying all these extra prayers and Kabbalistic things, and every pute under the sun, and doing all these other, you're saying that Mizmor 7 times before you blow the shofar, you're not davening Ashkenaz. You're basically doing a Sfarad. Oh, you're not saying Yatzbach Borkane, but you might as well be davening Nusach Sfarad. And you might as well change back to the way your ancestors used to do it. Just an idea. So there you have it.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.